One of the other pieces, just as far as how these older facilities develop over time, you see it with the stage that was built in cafeteria space. When those types of spaces get added in, things are sometimes missed as far as making the stage accessible, and smoke and fire evacuation is associated with it. As far as building safety and security goes, there's multiple locations in the building that have wire glass. It's probably something you really don't notice, but wire glass in doors and windows can be dangerous if someone were to fall into it. A big piece is the inclined lifts in the stairways. Since the building doesn't have an elevator, you have those inclined lifts at the stairs. And the problems you run into with those inclined lifts, well, for one, they're very slow if you need to use one to get to the upper floor of the building. But beyond that, when those are in use, should there be a need to evacuate the building, those inclined lifts are actually blocking the egress path. So that's a thing that, again, old buildings of this vintage start to run up against. Another piece is just the size of the building and the date, how it's been added onto over time. The building has no sprinkler system that follows through it. And then as far as you keep adding on to additions, the building's over its size, that will be allowable by building code. And then there's not really good fire separation between those additions. In the classroom wings, the stairs had ramps added to them, which I understand was done for accessibility, but those ramps also start to cause issues with egress and blocking egress path. Some other accessibility issues that you find in the building are just with the bathrooms. Imagine if you're in a wheelchair and had to get around this building and use some of these facilities. The issues you start to run into. The locker rooms have curbs at the showers, so making, again, access issues. On the structural side of things, no imminent issues or anything like that, but should the building need to be re-roofed at any point in time, what you run up against is having to reinforce the roof structure of the building. Current codes wouldn't allow, would have increased snow loading capacity requirements. So if you get into re-roofing the building, which every building has to be re-roofed at some point, you'd be into increasing the structural load capacity of the building. And then just kind of some final things before I wrap up and turn things over to Ray. Temperature controls an issue in the building as far as the mechanical systems go. And then in the lower level of the building, there's really significant rainwater infiltration in the spring, and then when you ever get heavy rains, a lot of water coming in that lower level of the building. You can imagine that the problems that creates around some mechanical systems down there. So we worked with a third-party cost estimator when we look at these facilities. And one of the things the third-party cost estimator does is he has a lot more information we do as far as gathering information from a broader reach of projects. We do a lot of work in the state, but he has even more work in the state. And that third-party cost estimator pulls in information, more current information about the cost of current construction. And you can see where the other schools ranked out for their renovation costs and where the Fort Kent Community School would be for just covering the renovation costs. And those would be purely these renovation costs to bring things up to code. You wouldn't be changing anything as far as the educational environment or how they looks or the appearance of the building. It'd be purely addressing code issues.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Ray Boldick from WBRC. I'll talk about site selection process going through for the particular school site. So the process is based on guidelines that Mike had talked about earlier by the Department of Education. This process typically focuses on land, location, access, suitability for the proposed education program, safe access, future expansion, recreational areas, and parking. So this is some of the criteria that was reviewed by the Site Selection Committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about what additional criteria was reviewed during the number of months that the committee met for this particular project. So back in April, WBRC was hired by Valley Unified to assist in reviewing the location for possible sites for the new school, coordinate with consultants like traffic, wetlands and soils, and to kind of review the particular sites, assist in providing information on the evaluation of the sites, help with developing the site criteria and questions for the matrix to score for the possible sites. And then as part of our scope of work, we kind of worked with the Valley Unified to kind of divide the site evaluation into two different parts. Part one would be review all particular sites within the valley. And then the second part would be a further review of up to 4 to 8 sites that was selected by the Site Selection Committee for further review. So as you can see by the slide up here, the initial review consisted of 52 possible sites within Fort Kent, Frenchville, St. Agatha, Madawaska. And then the reason we looked at this particular focus area, Department of Education has a guideline to kind of review the maximum number of students within the minimal travel distance. So we felt that this was the focus area to kind of review that particular guideline. So over the course of several months, we started in May meeting with the Site Selection Committee, and then ending at the end of October. A number of Site Selection Committee meetings. We met about 8 different times, which included the subcommittee meeting as well as the Site Selection Committee meetings. And what they had done, they alternated different locations for the particular meetings to provide additional information to the public in those areas. And then the committee actually, a number of the committee members met in early August, to kind of review and different site visits to review the particular sites. So what I'd like to do is kind of do a quick or a brief explanation on the meetings and what was discussed on those particular meetings. So the meeting number 1 was held in May, and it was the kickoff meeting for the Site Selection Committee. So everybody came in and sat down. And what we did at the kickoff meeting was kind of reviewed and discussed that the site selection process, the 21 steps that Mike had mentioned earlier. We reviewed the Department of Education state guidelines. Mike had mentioned that before as well. Reviewed the site selection process that would be divided into the 2 parts that I mentioned earlier, reviewing all the sites and then doing a further discussion or review of 4 to 8 sites at the selection of the Site Selection Committee. Then we reviewed suggested the Department of Education site selection criteria. You'll see a slide later of that suggested criteria. And then what we did was we provided a sample site selection matrix that had different criteria that's related to the guidelines provided by the Department of Education. And each criteria has a number of questions related to that. Typically there were 3 to 6 different questions related to those suggested criteria. And at the meeting, once we reviewed this kind of sample site selection criteria, a number of modifications were requested by the Site Selection Committee on the different criteria as well as the questions. And at that time, they thought that the site selection matrix, the sample one we provided, was geared more to a urban part of the state, so they felt like revising some of the criteria, some of the questions would actually provide being more in a rural setting, which is in the St. John Valley. So at the complete of that meeting, I was given a number of tasks for the next meeting that was going to be held in June to kind of review the site criteria, the questions that were provided by the Site Selection Committee to revise. Other items that I was looking for to do would be to continue to review the additional sites, updating the committee on this information, and then gathering information with the consultants, the wetlands, the vernal pools, and then traffic to kind of review the particular sites, to provide some additional information during the site selection process. So that was kind of the first meeting, and I had some tasks to go back and review and coordinate. So meeting number 2 was held in June, and at that time we came back. I revised the site selection criteria in the matrix, and based on the suggestions by the site selection committee, we also reviewed the site selection process again, reviewed the overall tentative schedule for the project, and then had some more discussion of the site selection matrix. And at the time when, on the last meeting, they asked me to kind of modify and review 9 different criteria of the 25, to kind of modify it to get it close to the feel of a rural feel. So as you can see by the slide, we reviewed the 52 possible, or not this slide, the last slide, the 52 possible sites, which included the 4 existing school sites. Typically, the Department of Education wants you to review the existing school sites as part of the site selection process. The WBRC presented the initial evaluation information of the 52 sites, which included speed limits, size of the lots, developable area, slopes, wetlands, vernal pools, access, water, sewer availability. And then once we reviewed that, the entire committee reviewed that information and discussed it, that information. The committee reached consensus to reduce the possible sites to 15 based on the criteria of the information that was provided and discussed during that meeting, which still included the 4 school sites. These remaining sites still had the original focus area of the 4 towns, and then at the completion of this meeting, I had some additional tasks required by the committee to continue to evaluate the remaining sites, continue to review the wetlands and vernal pools, and then identify the location of the fire, police, and hospitals within the overall map for discussion for the next meeting. So on meeting number 3, which was held in July, we reviewed the 15 sites that was requested during the last meeting. And at that time, at that meeting, we actually reviewed each one of them, looked at a map for each one, reviewed all the criteria that I mentioned before, the slopes, the wetlands, the availability of water, sewer. So with that, the travel distances, the weighted travel distances, school, 3-phase power, self-service, those are one of the things they wanted to add for the particular criteria. And then at that time, we also reviewed the sites as well as continued reviewing the site selection criteria in the matrix based on the suggested revisions from last time. Then after review of the additional information of the sites, and which would be provided to the committee reached consensus to reduce the sites to 6 for further review based on that information. Which you remember, part 1 was kind of reviewing all sites available. Part 2, which is reviewing 4 to 8 sites for further review by the site selection committee. So when we reduced, the committee reduced by consensus to 6 sites, we were entering the part 2 of the site selection process. The committee wanted to also review and kind of conduct some site visits on these remaining sites. So with that, they also requested, based on the revised matrix, based on the last several meetings, to have WBRC do an initial scoring of the remaining sites. So that was kind of our task, to provide that information for the next meeting. So like I mentioned before, we started scoring the sites because we were entering into the second part of the site selection process. So in early August, a number of members from the Site Selection Committee conducted some site visits. on the sites. But prior to that site visit, we were notified by a leaseholder and landowner of two sites that they were unwilling to sell or move forward with those particular projects. One was in Fort Kent and the other one was in St. Agatha. So by doing that, we kind of, those two sites were kind of eliminated from further consideration because they weren't available for the particular school project. So with that, we only, with the committee as well, just reviewed and conducted site visits on the 4 remaining sites. One was in Fort Kent, one was in St. Agatha, and then 2 in Frenchville. So once we completed that information, the task I had to do was to provide initial scoring for these sites. So that information was provided a few weeks prior to the August meeting to provide the committee allowing to review that information. So when we had the meeting at the end of August, meeting number 4, at the time of the meeting, the members who conducted the site visits provided an overview of what they saw, provided additional information to the committee that was present at that meeting. Then the committee reviewed the initial scoring that was provided by WBRC of the remaining 4 sites. There was a lot of discussion of that scoring, providing some feedback on the scoring, as well as further discussion with that. Of the 4 sites, 2 of them scored fairly low. The 2 sites that were scored a little bit higher were the Fort Kent site, the site number 43, and then the Frenchville site, 3A3B. So the committee, based on that, came to consensus to eliminate the 2 lower scoring sites, one in Frenchville and one in St. Agatha. So what the committee wanted to do is kind of concentrate on the 2 remaining sites, the one in Fort Kent and the one in Frenchville. So at that time, there was some discussion about potentially having the local police, fire, state to come and speak with the site selection committee to provide some additional information about their emergency services. So what we had done was the committee provided some questions for the emergency services and in advance of the meeting, so they could provide some responses to those questions, as well as answer any questions the committee may have. And then at this meeting too, there was some discussions about trying to prioritize first priority, second priority with the site selection matrix. So there was some discussion about that as well. So in meeting number 5, which was held in September, the committee members heard from the local police, fire, ambulance services, the state police, and each meeting was divided into 2. They had the police speak, and then they had the EMS and fire speak after. They had a set of questions that they were given prior to the meeting. They provided those responses to the site selection committee. And then at that time, the committee asked some additional questions and as part of their review of the emergency services available within the particular area. Once those 2 discussions were complete, there was some further discussion about the initial scoring of the 2 remaining sites. And at that time, based on that information and reviewing the matrix that was presented so far, the committee actually wanted to kind of revisit, kind of take a pause and review the site selection matrix and categories as well. Again, so as part of the next meeting, which would be in early October, they suggested dividing the committee into small groups and reviewing different criteria, and then reporting back to the larger group for further discussion. And what they wanted to do before any revisions were approved, they reached consensus from the entire committee on any revisions for that. So when we reached meeting number 6, which was in early October, the site selection committee was divided into those small groups, and they reviewed every one of the criteria in the small groups, came back with recommendations, whether to keep it, whether to eliminate it, whether to modify it, whether to revise it. And then that information was provided to the entire group. They all reviewed each one of those revisions, eliminations, or keeping the same with the committee. The committee reached consensus on every one of them on the revisions. So I think the committee felt that by doing this, it further kind of tailored to what they wanted to see on the matrix for these questions for the scoring. And then also each category was identified in the first or second priority. I'll have the slides, later slides, I kind of talk about what the final matrix with the first and second priorities were. So at the end of this meeting, I think everybody left the meeting with the revised matrix that they felt was more in line with what they were looking for, and they reached consensus on that. One item at this meeting, there was a discussion about creating a subcommittee, transportation committee, to review the travel distances and the travel times for buses that the students would be taking at these particular sites. So the committee was created. They reviewed this information at a later date. It was in the middle of October. That information, they would come up with some recommendations for the site selection committee to kind of review and approve prior to the final scoring. So they had this meeting in the middle of October. The committee came with some recommendations, a consensus of 8 different criteria, or 8 different questions for that particular criteria based on the weighted travel distances and times that they reviewed as part of this. So that information was brought back to the committee on the final meeting, which was on meeting number 7 in late October. So at that time, the subcommittee provided the recommendations for those questions for the bus travel time and distances. The committee discussed it, reviewed it, those recommendations, and came to consensus that they were going to accept the recommendations by this subcommittee. So that was included in the site matrix. Then the committee, as they were continuing reviewing the site matrix and the criteria, there was one criteria, the service criteria, that the committee discussed and indicated that they wanted to eliminate that and discuss that, and came to consensus that that was eliminated from the matrix. So at that time, we provided scoring for each one of the categories and questions. A lot of the information on the scoring was provided on this initial scoring done back in August, but it was refined based on additional information, based on information provided by the Site Selection Committee on revisions and modifications to those criteria. And then we went through the entire scoring, and then as each category was reviewed and discussed, the committee came to consensus to move on to the next criteria. So in the end, the 3A, 3B site was the recommended site in Frenchville. The committee came to consensus to make that recommendation to the Board of Directors of Valley Unified. So at the end of the meeting, there was a consensus to kind of move forward with that and send that information to the Board of Directors. So earlier I mentioned the suggested criteria for site selection. You can see there's 25 different criteria for that. Growth, water, sewer, I talked about a lot of that stuff in my presentation. Looking at adjacent land use, sidewalks, off-site improvements, lot size, safety, and transportation. So this is a suggested guideline that the Department of Education likes to see in the site selection process. So this is after starting in May and then ending in the end of October. This was the approved site selection criteria for the final scoring of the sites. You can see by the first and second priority is highlighted. First priority is highlighted in yellow, and then second in blue. And then you can see that there was about 20 different criteria in this, and then there was suggested criteria for the Department of Education. They had 25. So I think the committee really vetted this out and came to consensus on this particular criteria for the scoring of the site. And this is the Frenchville site, the site 3A, 3B. 3A, you can see the Technology Center, and then 3B is the site highlighted in green. There's an access to Route 1, and then we're looking at a potential secondary access or emergency access, Spruce Street to Church Street, or utilizing the existing St. John Valley Tech Center Drive as well. So then there's also potential future expansion land available as well. So that's the end of my presentation, and then I'll turn it over to Ben.
We're going to move to questions here in a minute. Before we do, just a reminder that this vote here tonight is for the site only. You're not voting on the entire school project. The gentleman did remind you that it's a three-step process. This vote tonight for site, the second vote to come on concept, and then the final vote, which is when you go to the referendum, when you go to vote at your local polling place, and you're going to have a referendum vote. That's the vote that's going to either approve or end the entire project if it's allowed to move forward from this point on. Right now, here we are in 2020. I need you to understand that when we were awarded this project, we had a very strict timeline that was given to us that said that this project needed site approval and concept approval before 2020. We had started site selection on that time, and then the Board of Education kind of changed their tune with that and relaxed the timeline. They said, you can take more time as long as the project is moving forward. So I know a lot of people have questions in the room about numbers. Well, what are the costs going to be? What are the figures going to be? Now that we have a site, we can work with an engineering firm on those estimates based on a concept design that they will design, and the numbers will be forthcoming where we can do comparative costs. Right now it says that concept review would be in 2021. If we're not ready in 2021 because we don't have all the numbers, the state board has said as long as we're moving forward, we can extend this. So this is not a set in stone timeline. This is suggested if we want to get construction in 24, 25. But if we don't have the numbers and we don't have the answers during the next phase when the numbers are supposed to come, we don't feel it's appropriate to have you all in this room again for another vote without numbers that are supposed to be aligned to that second vote of concept. So just keep that in mind as well. That being said, I will turn it back over to our moderator for questions.
Thank you, Mike and Ray, and thank you, Ben. As you've already heard it a couple times, but as we enter the question and answer period of this hearing, remember that we are here this evening to discuss and vote on a single item, that of site selection. Any and all questions asked must pertain to that item solely. Questions not germane to the item will be ruled out of order. All questions will be directed to the moderator, who will then redirect the questions to the proper personnel to answer. Before asking any question, Please state your name and the town in which you are registered. Because of the numbers here, I wish we had that many people here when I was coaching basketball, but I would ask that you limit your questions as to length. I would ask that you do not come up more than twice to ask questions, as you're gonna, if that happens, I'll be past my bedtime. Please be clear as to what your question is. The chair will cut you short if he feels that you are giving us a dissertation or simply asking a question. In other words, be to the point. I would ask that anybody that wishes to ask a question to come up the center aisle. We'll have microphones for you. And state your name, town that you're from, and ask your question, please. Floor is now open to questions.
Hi, Sandy. Oh, Sandy Keller here, 410. I just have a question on the 25 points that were shown in high priority and second priority on the slide. What does the qualifying characteristics of community vitality?
That's an engineer question.
Oh, wouldn't have suspected that.
So community vitality is investments to public facilities such as schools. Should be strategically located to foster community identity and vitality in a manner that complements the character of these communities. Then reconstruct or replace existing educational facilities. So let's try to get community support and to try to facilitate identity of the community.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
That didn't take long.
I gave him a chance. Mr. Moderator, before I can ask my question, my name is Luke Rosignol. I live in Mapleton, so I'm obviously not a resident of any of the communities involved. I'm here in my capacity as an attorney representing several residents of Fort Kent. And so I know I have to ask your permission to be able to ask a question.
The chair recognizes the speaker.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the presentation as beginning my question, and I'd like to make a point about what Mr. Sidwa said, that democracy is being shown here. But I also want to highlight, and this goes to my question, a fundamental aspect of democracy, given the fact that a fundamental aspect of democracy is due process. I hope that someone on the panel of presenters can explain to these wonderful people in a way that addresses serious concerns about the due process of the site selection process. There are several members who were on that subcommittee and on your SAD board that have raised in public and in meetings very serious concerns about how the matrix was revised and applied. Now, to the engineer's presentation, I heard him indicate several times that they came to consensus. But I'm not sure it's clear, at least to my clients who are concerned citizens in the town of Fort Kent, who the they were. Because there are several of those people from Fort Kent that were not in consensus with how the site selection was done. So I don't know if it's a question for the engineers or the administrators But I think that's the most important question that these people need to have an answer to tonight. Thank you.
And Mr. Rosendahl certainly isn't the moderator.
I know.
So I'll give that one a shot. And I'll start back at the initial meeting, the kickoff meeting with the Site Selection Committee, when WBRC came in. Ray Bolduc was present. He showed us a copy of a matrix that had been used for other projects. There were some suggested revisions made at that time. Toward the end of that meeting, there was consensus. Let's let him go back, make those revisions. We'll revisit that at our next meeting. At the next meeting, we spent a brief amount of time, or the Site Selection Committee spent a brief amount of time at the end of that meeting and began asserting the importance that we divide that matrix into first and second level priorities. And the meeting concluded with that level of consensus, that would be what we would address. At the June meeting, the third meeting, which was scheduled for July, the matter of revisiting the matrix was on the agenda. And when that agenda item came up, there was a suggestion made that we've done a lot of work on the matrix. Why don't we go ahead and continue with the scoring, and then we can revisit the matrix as we need to. There was no objection to that. That's taken as a general consensus. There was still time, for us during that meeting to discuss that the meeting concluded without any further discussion. So there was general accord that we'll do that. In August, we didn't spend a lot of time on the matrix. There was a lot of discussion about needing to hear from police and EMS and fire services, which was the primary subject of the September 24 meeting. At that meeting, it was determined that the next meeting, October 8th, which was held at the Dr. Levac School in Frenchville, that the group would really take a look at the matrix. Now we're down to a couple of sites. We really need to make sure that this matrix fits the needs of the rural St. John Valley region. And so that was what was done at the October 8th meeting. We had small group work, and then the small group representatives from the small groups reported back out, and then there was general consensus on all but 2 items, and one dealt with student transportation, and that one was revisited on October 16 by a 4-person subcommittee, what we call the technical advisors to the subcommittee. There were members of the subcommittee, but we wanted them to have an extended voice, both in the selection of the engineering and architectural firm for conducting site selection services, the phase 1 services project. So at the conclusion of that meeting, it was mentioned by a site selection committee member that, okay, when we come back here now on the 29th, outside of these 2 items that we haven't concluded, we're not touching the matrix anymore. And there was no objection to that at all, okay? And at the onset of the October 29 meeting, that same site selection committee member said, okay, I just want to clarify, what we're doing tonight is we're reviewing scores, we're not doing anything to the matrix, okay? Other than reviewing those 2 items that are left for consideration, we're just focusing on scoring. There were no objections to that, and the meeting proceeded. So I don't know if that answers your question, Mr. Rosendahl.
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk again.
I don't know if you are either. We'll ask the
I
moderator.
think he said I get to go up twice. Never
I
said
got somebody else.
I want, anybody else can go,
Okay.
absolutely.
Mr. Sear, I think you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Greg Sear, and I've been in Fort Kent for a little over 10 years, and I love this place. In my history, I've spent some time as a university system trustee, so I'm a little bit familiar with capital budgets, their allocation of sports and discussion projects, and what can happen to them if there's any impediments to the continued growth. Mr. Sear said it a couple of times, if we're moving forward. If we're moving forward. The key question in my mind tonight, because what ends up happening is if this site selection process goes down, there are a number of communities in the southern part of the state that will see a $100 million opportunity, and they will jump at it, and they will put pressure at the Board of Education, and they will put pressure at the Department of Education to pinnacle it on somewhere else. And believe me, if you're keeping money in Aroostook County, that's not something that the southern part of the state likes much. And so my question is, can someone tell us if a no vote from any of the communities is a sign to the Board of Education, Department of Education, that we are no longer moving forward? And that's the phraseology they use, Mr. Sirwell.
I'm going to answer the question, actually. To answer your question, we have been advised that this is a regional project. And in a regional construct, you need regional partners. And if the regional partners do not want to be partners anymore, the project is not going to be a successful project. The Department of Education is not going to spend millions of dollars in what they deem will be a failure at referendum vote. So they're looking at this as a sampling of what that final vote may be. Ultimately, it goes in the hands of the State Board of Education, and they determine what happens. I don't know here if in this room, if it's a yes vote that's overwhelming, or a no vote that's overwhelming, or a very close vote on either side. I don't know what they'll determine, but we have been advised by the previous administration in Augusta and the current administration that consensus is the best way to get this project to move forward.
My name is Tricia Rupert Nason. I'm from Fort Kent. I have 2 young children who will hopefully be going to school here, or to the high school. So for me, I think we all want the additional amenities for our kids. Like, I don't think that's a question. But to me, the question is this site going to serve our children? And I have 2 main concerns. One is transportation and transportation time. Less so for the children here in Fort Kent, although it's a nuisance. But, you know, you have kids all the way up in Allagash who are going to be a 2-hour drive to get in. But also amenities. So there are some very nice to have amenities with the Fort Kent location, like a lot of our kids go to the college to take college courses, and that's not going to be particularly feasible for them to come back here and take a college course from Frenchville, the ski hill, etc. But perhaps the most important, if we want to call it amenity is the safety services. It's having access to a hospital, a fire, police. I know of at least 2 children currently in the school with epilepsy who regularly go to the hospital. I know the parents very well. I'm one of those children, and she has to be able to be at the hospital within 10 minutes of seizure. They will have to leave this community. And I don't think they're unique. I don't think that they'll be the last children with medical issues, where that 20, 30 minutes to the hospital is a big deal. So what I want to know, my question, is how was it decided that fire, police, ambulance, which to me seem like they should be top priority, got second priority in the site selection matrix?
There's a lot of questions there. I'll try my best. With regards to transportation, we're in a rural area. We recognize that that's going to be a challenge. However, please be mindful that the commutes to Fort Kent will continue as is. So Benny's bus ride, and I hope Benny's still driving when this school is constructed, Benny's bus route is still going to be the same from Allagash all the way to Fort Kent Elementary School to drop off our little ones. And then it's a direct shot from Fort Kent Elementary School to the Frenchville site. So there's no pickup points from Fort Kent going up to Frenchville, so you're adding additionally 15 to 20 minutes to the commute. It's not ideal, and I'm not advocating that it's ideal, but that is what it is. With regards to early college, a lot of people think that a lot of our kids are going onto campus to have classes. That is no more the way that early college works. Early college is happening in our school. We have teachers who are dual enrolled, and the classes are here in Fort Kent Community High School. They're also in Madawaska Middle High School, and those are delivered by our teachers for college credit. It's called dual enrollment. There's also some online classes that are being done. Not a whole lot of back and forth across the campus like we want to believe that it used to be. It's not a whole lot like that. Our University of Maine system is a partner in this project. They are a partner as well as Northern Maine Community College, and they have agreed to have a presence in the new school. They will have a presence there and offer programming there. We're even working on students graduating, those who want, with a 2-year associate's degree out of high school. That currently does not exist here. As far as the priorities, the site selection committee are the ones who determine the priorities. So I don't know how that came as a second priority. That was their determination based on their conversations. Is that fair?
Okay.
Roger Verity, Fort Kent. Do I have your permission to speak?
Yeah, I mean, you're a resident, so.
Oh, okay. First, I'd like to answer the question with respect to the desire of the communities in what we call up here the rest of the state. If this is such a hot ticket, explain to me how it is that only 7 applications were submitted statewide. Of those 7, there were only 3 that were approved. Of those 3, there's 1 that opted out. 2. Of the 2, Danforth said, we don't want to be part of it. Danforth is 34.2 miles from Holton, about the distance from Allagash. Now, my question to the distinguished members of the panel, and I do hope you won't impose a gag rule of 45 minutes, because this is the voice of the people, and it should be heard, because the voice of the people, as they used to say in Rome, is the voice of God. So my question is, I wonder, I've been researching this now for 3 years, and I'm reasonably well documented, but I still have to follow the money. I still don't know exactly where that $300 million is coming from. I do know that it's tax. It's not a gift. Okay, I wondered if members of the panel knew anything about the accidents that happened in the St. John Valley, school bus accidents. For example, if you're familiar with it, maybe you can tell us about the school bus that went down to the river at the narrow gauge. Maybe you can tell us about the car full of kids who were students at UMFK, who, to avoid going down to the river just this side of the tracks, they overcorrected too much. They had a head-on collision. 3 kids died, including one of my advisees. One was engaged to one of the students that died. So I wonder to what extent this committee gave some thought to the hazard of driving 70, and they would impose 20 more miles. I wonder if I'm going to vote no against this thing on humanitarian grounds.
Mr. Verity, would you get to your question, please?
I just asked my question and I have one more. My second question is, I wonder if the committee has taken the time to review very carefully the school construction legislation and guidelines.
That is out of order. as we are selecting, we're questioning site selection and the renewal of these schools. That is all we're testing.
This has to do exactly with site selection, Lloyd. Site selection. According to the Maine Department of Education, read it. The site selection is supposed to be in accord with 3 criteria. The welfare of the students.
Point of order.
The welfare of the students,
Mr.
the
Perry,
safety of the
there's a
students,
point of order to be answered.
and the health of the students. You think about that.
Where's the point of order? Mr. Hart? What's your point of order? Thank you.
I will answer Mr. Parody's question, though. Mr. Parody, your first point about the amount of applications for this, you're right, there were only 7 applications, but that involved over 24 school districts. So 7 applications with a combined 24 school districts. It was a very competitive application, and you're right, 3 were selected. That's because the state was mindful that they could only fund possibly 1. You were incorrect, 1 did not back out. All of the 3 top are still in the running for it. You are correct that Danforth did back out in the Holton region, but Dexter is waiting in 3rd place for our money to be lost so that they can take advantage of it. So that's just for that purpose right there. With regards to transportation and the humanitarian part, I do have a school bus director here who will tell you, and you can talk to him, that school bus transportation is the safest transportation known to our entire transportation. School bus transportation is the most safe way to travel, and our bus drivers here are the very best.
Hi, my name is Matthew Rio from Fort Kent. I have a very short question for you. My question is very simple and direct. Given the closeness in scoring between the Fort Kent and the Frenchville site, was a ranked choice voting referendum considered to give to the people to ultimately let the people decide the final site?
I don't believe that was ever considered or put on anyone's. I don't believe that we ever considered that as a ranked choice. Bring the 2 sites forward. Is that what I'm asking?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that was not. The site selection committee, and I say we, I'm sorry, I played no part in the site selection process, regardless of what you may read on Facebook. I only pressed click on the computer at the meetings. But the site selection committee did agree that when the process started, they wanted to come to a consensus on a site. There was some language in the original write-up of the guidelines that if they could not come to consensus, they were able to bring 2 sites forward. I believe that's what the language said. But on that final vote, they came to a consensus. Every member did vote for it, and I know since then that's changed, but at that time they came to consensus, so they agreed to only bring 1 site.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Paulton from Fort Kent. My question is, what site would be in the best interest and well-being of the children?
Boyd, can you repeat your question, please?
What would be the best interest and well-being for the children?
What site would the best?
I think that the answer to that question is the site that was ultimately agreed upon by the site selection committee for recommendation to the Valley Unified Board of Directors.
Mr. Rosendahl, I haven't forgotten you.
Okay, I appreciate it, but if somebody else that wants to go before me. Go ahead. I defer to your citizens.
Hi, I'm Rick Douglas. I'm a recent transplant. I love it here in Aroostook County. I live in Fort Kent. I'm a first-time homeowner. My question might seem obvious to people here who own property in Fort Kent and Aroostook County for a long time, but I'm curious to know what impact this project is going to have on local property taxes.
That would be, I think, best answered at step 2, at stage 2. at the next meeting.
At the next meeting.
Yeah, and he's absolutely right. And I know that people are tired of hearing this answer, but that really comprehensive cost impact, cost analysis, new versus old, as much information as we can gather regarding property tax impact, new versus old, is all part of the next phase of the project.
Would the selection of one site over another have any impact on the property taxes?
We didn't assess whether or not that was not assessed within the site selection process. It only comes in the second phase of the project.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you again. Given that last question, and given what I think was a good point made by Mr. Silva, that from his understanding, as I understand it, this process is not set in stone in terms of timing. If I understand that to be correct, then I guess my question would be, and given that it's pretty clear, given the number of people here, and given what's been going on in your communities, with signs and social media, things dividing your own community, why would it not make the most sense to create full consensus, given that you have extra time, to properly redo the site selection process and allow people to have a full say in this process?
I didn't notice there were any signs in town. By the way, you can't put signs on the lawn of the high school if voting's going on at the high school.
Right.
So those of you that saw me take signs off, I wasn't doing that because, and they're in my office if you want them. I'll give them to you. I didn't throw them away, but you can't do that at the high school. So anyway, about the signs. Mr. Rossignol, valid point. In fact, Mr. Sibley and Mr. Gendro, two of the board reps at Valley Unified, did bring up that concern before the Valley Unified Board moved to ratify the site selection. I think they can both attest that I tried to advocate for that as well, urging the board that it's best if we move forward as partners rather than dragging somebody along. There was some good dialogue between the Valley Unified Board members, and at that time, I do remember that a couple of them spoke to, we do need to address some of the issues at hand, especially concerning some of the concerns we have with governance and some other things. But with regards to site, they felt that if we were to go, or if they were to go back on the site selection agreement, that would say that the whole process they went through for 9 months was all for none. Right. So at that point, they felt that the project must move forward, and then we must work on the issues, but the site is a done deal. So that's what they agreed to.
Mr. Birdie?
Paul Burke, Fort Kent. My question is directed to WBRC regarding the screen that I have in front of me. And I don't know if those 20 things up there are in priority, but I'm not sure where you come up with community vitality. And maybe I don't know what vitality means, but I know this community here, hosting all of its events, the civic organizations that we currently have, we are a vibrant community, I believe, compared to Frenchville. If I'm not mistaken, Fort Kent, going back to number 2, and maybe Don Guimont can correct me on this, our former town manager, but Fort Kent is the only town that's seen growth in this valley in the last 10 years. So I'd like to know where you've gotten your information or how you're basing Frenchville to be a more vital community than ours. And if you see growth going on in Frenchville, I'd like to know where you've come up with that, with those 2 issues. Thank you.
That's a really good question. The numbering, it's just the numbering that's on the screen. Whether it's, it's number 1 versus number 20, it's just numbering sequence. So it's really not a priority based on that numbering shown. And then community vitality. And the way the site selection matrix works, there's a number of different questions for each category, and each category is scored appropriately based on the committee's review and discussion of each one of those categories. So Fort Kent will have, has community vitality, so it was scored accordingly. But when you score the matrix, it's a collective scoring based on all the questions. Each criteria has 5 different questions, so they could get up between 0 to potentially 10 points based on how the committee answers the question on that particular scoring matrix on that category. And then on the growth is related to the service center that the state has for a particular site. So Fort Kent certainly is a service center, Madawaska is a service center. So the scoring was done appropriately based on that. But like I said before, each category has its 5 different questions, and everything was scored accordingly. So, and it's a collective score. So some sites may get more points on a particular category, and others may get less. So it's like I said, it's a collective scoring for the particular site.
Thank you. Mr. Pettingill.
Thank you. I'm Jesse Pettingill from Wallagrass. I'm the head coach for the varsity Mustangs football team that pulls athletes from all 3 schools. We like to say that we were Valley Unified before Valley Unified was Valley Unified. Lloyd was my guidance counselor. Grew up in St. Gaudens, so Lloyd was my guidance counselor growing up, so that's pretty cool. I had a question about time. The lawyer brought up the issue of time, and I recognized that there was some 8 months or so given to the site selection process. And let's say we were to revisit the site selection process. This is my question. Let's say we were to revisit the site selection process, scrap the whole thing that just happened, revisit it, and then in that site selection process, we decided that we would choose the site in Fort Kent. What are the odds that there wouldn't be at that point, right, like some other concerned citizen group that would poke up somewhere else? And and I'm asking what the odds are to anybody who wants to answer that. And if that is the odds, right, what would be the odds then that after 2 failed site selection processes, the state would say, hey, that $100 million, here it is. I'd like to know that answer.
I think the odds are very slim. I think, and this is not me answering as a superintendent, but answering as just a regular guy. I think had the Fort Kent site had been selected, there would be different opinions in this room about very many things, but there would also be very different opinions in other communities, and that's just to be fair.
Mr. Harvey.
Warren Harvey from Fort Kent here. Right now, tonight, we're being asked to vote yes or no, Friendsville or no. Why? As you can see, we've never had a gymnasium full like that. You said it like. Why don't you let the people vote? I know we had a committee, they recommended. Let the people vote what they want throughout all the districts. At that point, whoever wins, wins. They're the taxpayers. They're the ones that are going to foot the bill at the end of all of this. So let the people vote on this instead of just the committee.
Okay, seeing no other.
I have quite a few people texting me, can we vote, can we vote, can we vote?
That's why I left my cell phone home. Okay, at this point, here's how we will proceed. And this is simply to regurgitate what's already been said to some degree. The vote that will be taken, ballot boxes will be collected, brought to their respective towns, sealed, and counted by the respective town clerks tomorrow. forwarded to the Valley Unified Superintendent for their meeting tomorrow evening at 6. They will then forward the results to the Department of Education. I'd appreciate if you'd listen, because results will be sent to the Department of Education for its determination on allowing Valley Unified to continue in its efforts to study the consolidation. I will restate very simply, a yes vote indicates that you agree to the site selection and wish the Department of Education to allow Valley Unified to continue its studies into the viability of the project so that we can be back here and vote a second time after concept and dollar figures are in front of you. A no vote indicates that you do not agree to the site selection and that the Department of Education will determine whether or not the viability of this consolidation will or will not continue. At this point, the Fort Kent and Wallagrass ballot boxes are on the stage. The other 3 communities are in the hallway where you picked up your ballots. Voting is now open.
Orderly fashion. No pushing, no biting, no kicking.
I think so. Nobody had one. You have one?
Thank you very much, sorry.
I know, it's crazy. Is she alive? She's alive.
another night out for you? Huh? Come on. A lot of people, huh? What's that? I have some reservations
Thank you everyone for coming once again. Be kind on Facebook. Be kind on Facebook to one another. Be kind on Facebook. Delete your accounts.
Oh yeah. Well, hopefully we'll get something.